Hi, this is Paul with Paul's Passing Thoughts and Tank Ministries. Um, on break from nursing school and really don't have time to be doing this video, but I ran across it on Twitter and am compelled. So I didn't do a lot of digging into this. I am assuming this is Vodi Bachman speaking at the most recent Shepherds Conference at Grace Community Church out in California, LA area, I think. John MacArthur Jr.'s church. So this audience is going to represent mainline evangelicalism in the United States, and certainly John MacArthur Jr. is one of the more respected pastors in the whole church scene. So what is the gospel? Vodi Bachman lays it down, okay? Make the gospel go viral. So this is being held up as the epitome of the gospel, as fabulously articulated by Vodi Bachman. So let's watch this. It's only 4 minutes. Let's watch this. And then I'm going to have some comments about it afterwards. Suffice to say for now, this is a overtly law-based false gospel. The gospel you are about to hear is the very false gospel that the Apostle Paul spent most of his ministry refuting. So here we go. Let's listen to it.
When people say, no, our problem is this, our problem is that, we say, no. Our problem is that God created the world. And God created man, and he put man in the garden to keep the garden. And he gave the man a command. And he held that man to perfect, perpetual obedience to that command. And he promised him life if he kept it, and death if he didn't. And he didn't keep it. He ate. And because he ate, because of that one man, sin entered the world, and death through sin. And everyone born from that man through ordinary generation inherited that man's sin nature. And because of that sin nature, sins proceed from it. And our world is broken because of that sin. And we stand guilty before a holy and righteous God. And we know that he's holy, and we know that he's righteous, and we crave justice. But the problem is that if God gives us justice, we all die. And so that God, in his goodness and in his mercy, sent forth his son, who was not born of ordinary generation, but was born of a virgin. Yes, the virgin birth matters. Why? Because if he's born of ordinary generation, he's born in sin. But because he's not born of ordinary generation, he's not born in sin. He's clean of sin. His record is clean. And he keeps his record clean. And he obeys God's law. And because he's fully God and fully man, he obeys the law of God on our behalf in his active obedience. And then in his passive obedience, God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us. All we like sheep had gone astray. Each of us had turned to his own way, but God laid upon him the iniquity of us all. And Christ died for sin once for all, the just for the unjust. And God imputes our sinfulness to him. And he nails our sinfulness to the tree. And Christ dies and raises again on the third day for our justification. And there's another imputation. The righteousness of Christ is actually imputed to us so that God can be both just and the justifier of the one who places faith in Jesus Christ, so that all those who come to Christ may enter in, so that all those who place faith in Christ might be saved, but not only saved, but sanctified, because he's the firstborn of many brethren. We're justified and we're adopted into the family of God, and we're sanctified, and as his children we begin to bear the family resemblance, and we're further sanctified throughout this life by the very same gospel that saves us, until one day when it's all said and done, we're not just saved from the penalty of sin, we're not just saved from the power of sin, but one day we're glorified and saved from the very presence of sin. That's the gospel that we preach. That's the gospel that we need. And that's the gospel that's more than enough.
So, standing ovation. And again, the problem that we have here is this is an overtly false gospel. And now I want to get into why that's the case. And I'm going to bring up... So, what's the problem with this gospel? Let's look at it, and I kind of mapped it out here. I put this together quickly this morning to try to kind of keep me on track. Here is the problem. The Protestant gospel is so totally upside down that it's really hard to stay on track with explaining even the basics, because it's so wrong on so many levels that you find yourself getting off on rabbit tracks and all of these residual areas that leads to this like domino effect that makes everything else wrong. So I'm going to try to keep this basic and short. So I mapped it out here in this dimensional analysis, or visual map, or whatever you want to call it. So Voddie Baucham starts out with the fact, what he's preaching, the gospel he is preaching, of course, is that of double imputation. And again, it's just an overtly false gospel that turns the Bible completely upside down. Okay? He starts out mentioning the Adamic covenant, which is what all of this double imputation gospel is primarily based on. Now, a lot of evangelicals will deny that they hold to the Adamic covenant, and will claim, no, we believe this variation or that variation, whether new covenant theology or whatever covenant theology you're talking about. But in all cases, the end result is double imputation. And so we'll get to that. So primarily, though, the vast majority of all of this is based on the Adamic covenant, which is just so many problems, okay? And if you look on the upper left-hand corner there, I ran across, in thinking about this, a booklet that I wrote in 2015 entitled Bible Covenants, an Overview and Relevance to the Gospel. If I find some time while I'm on break, I'll post that and some other booklets and pamphlets that I had written, and I'll post that on our free library on tank.online if I get time. However, if you would like a free booklet, this free booklet, shoot me your mailing address in the comment section of this post, okay, and or email me. I think that email me your mailing address, whatever, and I'll send you whatever you want for free, absolutely for free. And I can perhaps dig up the PDF file to that booklet and send you that as well. But that's Bible Covenants, an overview and relevance to the gospel, and it really unfolds all of the vast problems with this Adamic covenant, and I'll review a few here. Covenants in the Bible that are covenants made by God have certain elements and characteristics of which the Adamic covenant has no relationship to whatsoever. First of all, God's covenants are always dependent on God. Always dependent on God's actions. And if you go down a little bit, the covenant that is predicated by the gospel in the Bible is the covenant of promise with Abraham. Actually, it was a promise made to Abraham and Christ, and that's in the book of Galatians, okay? But it's always dependent on God. As Vodi Bachman talked about, the Adamic covenant was based on Adam keeping the covenant, okay? Which of course didn't happen, but that's not an element normally. Put it this way, all the other covenants by God are dependent on his actions and not man, based on what he would do, right? Let me see here. Who the covenant is with is stated. You see that up there. The purpose of the covenant. Let me see, what else do we have here? That's about it. Now, the huge problem with the Adamic covenant that basically, well, I'll get to that in a minute. The huge problem is that they actually cite Genesis 3:15 and the whole thing about God saying that he would bring a seed that would bruise or crush the head of the serpent, whatever. So if the Adamic covenant is an actual covenant with God, this is a covenant, and this is the verse of scripture they cite, Genesis 3:15. This is a covenant actually made with the serpent in the garden. Okay. So, I mean, it's just crazy. Also, if the true gospel is based on the Adamic covenant, and not the covenant of promise made to Abraham, as explained in the book of Galatians by Paul, this would necessarily exclude the Gentiles from the new covenant. Okay? And that's not the strongest argument against the Adamic covenant, but certainly if you read the scriptures closely, this was a covenant made at least in part with Satan, or the serpent. That's who God is talking to in Genesis 3:15. Okay, so it's absurd on its face. All right. And I have, if you can see Galatians there, circled in red, and the reason I did that is this whole idea, as explained in this booklet in much more detail, the whole idea of this Adamic covenant and it being the premise of the new covenant and why Christ came, this whole idea, I'll get into it now, that Christ came to restore the Adamic covenant, and please note, this is all law-based. This is all law-based and not new birth-based. The new creaturehood-based gospel. Okay? So it's this whole idea that the Adamic covenant, obviously law-based, right? Adam didn't hold up his end, so Christ came back to restore the Adamic covenant and pave the way for the gospel. It's all absurd. It's clearly justification by the law, and not a justification or righteousness apart from the law that the Apostle Paul preached. But you say, Paul, yeah, it's law-based, but Jesus keeps the law for us. Well, here's where people get tripped up. Who keeps the law is not relevant here. It's the law, period. That's the whole problem. So let's move on from that down to New Covenant. I covered all of that. Not the strongest argument, but indeed the Gentiles would be excluded from this particular covenant because it wasn't made with the Gentiles. And you think back to the book of Galatians, Paul's whole argument is the fact that the law even comes about 400 years after the covenant with Abraham to Christ. Okay, the promise, what's known as the promise, a major theme throughout the Bible. The law even comes 400 years after that. So, the promise is not based on law in any way, shape, or form. All right? And so the Adamic covenant comes, Lord knows how many years even before the Abrahamic covenant. It's all absurd. It's gross elementary error from beginning to end. So let's move on. So we'll go over to the new birth, and keep going down from the right side, ends condemnation of the law. All right. In Protestantism and this double imputation gospel, you're clearly still under law. We'll discuss a little bit more on that later. Under the new birth, you are not only declared righteous, and you hear these guys like Vodi Bachman say this all the time. Justification is a forensic or legal declaration. All right? So I got a question for you. How is that a righteousness apart from the law? Right? Okay, I mean, even a child can see this. So the law, the new birth, we are not only merely declared righteous, we're righteous as a state of being. Well, looking at the circles here, what makes us righteous? Perfect law keeping? No. 1 John chapter 3. The very fact that God's seed is within us, period, it makes us righteous. And that gives us, that new state of being, gives us a whole different relationship to the law. It doesn't exclude the law, okay, or abrogate the law. It's just a different relationship to the law that the new birth gives us, which it is now a guide for loving God and others, all right, and is for sanctification. So it's a justification that's not based on the law you see there. Does it mean that there are no consequences in our life for failing to love? Well, no. And that's where the fatherly chastisement of God comes in. All right? In Protestantism, clearly, we still remain under the condemnation of the law, or what people like Phil Johnson, John MacArthur Jr.'s right-hand man, calls the, quote, righteous demands of the law. All right? He says it. These people say it outright, that as Christians we are still, quote, under the righteous demands of the law. Okay? Well, we're still under law, but it's a different relationship. It's a calling to love God and others according to the law, and love fulfills the law, right? Okay? So it's a whole different relationship to the law. Okay? And our righteousness is based on one thing and one thing only, the indwelling seed of God. And I've got the circle there, 1 John chapter 3, okay? And not condemnation. All right, so let's move over to the other side. This whole idea of double imputation. Go down a little bit by double imputation, and as Vodi Bachman, you heard him say, passive and active, and he described what that is. This necessarily requires ritual worship. And in listening to this a second time while it was playing here, for you folks that are watching this video, I missed it the first time, but Vodi Bachman actually makes a reference to returning to, and I forget his exact words and everything, but in passing, it's a reference to returning to the same gospel that originally saved us, which is a big mantra in this double imputation thing. Well, what's that mean? Well, they say, of course, Christ only died one time, once and for all, for the elect or the saved. And yes, the justification is a finished work, because Christ died once for the ungodly. But what they then fail to mention is that double imputation requires this perpetual return and making kind of a reinstituting or reapplying Christ's original death. So yeah, what Christ did is a finished work, but our work in reapplying the original gospel or Christ's death, or reapplying his death to what they call present sin in our lives, which I would argue is incorrectly called present sin, but a failure to love, which can lead to chastisement. Now, here and there in the Bible, Paul and others do make a reference to Christians sinning, but that's got to be in context. It's just like the word salvation in the Bible. Salvation, the word salvation in the Bible doesn't only mean salvation of the soul. There's also redemption, which is the salvation of the body, and other salvations, okay? But context determines what salvation we're talking about. Same way with sin, all right? When a believer sins, per se, it's a failure to love. It's not a sin that condemns us. Got it? And Luther and Calvin especially in the Institutes, and Luther as well, stated in many different writings in no uncertain terms that though Christians are under grace, present sin does technically yet condemn us. Okay, so we need this ongoing reapplication of Christ's death on the cross, and this is key to cover present sin. So you see where the gospel of double imputation is a covering, and not of sin, a covering of sin that has to be perpetually utilized rather than an actual ending of sin. Okay, and that's a huge difference. So, moving on down here, they even say, refer to a beginning justification, and this is to the right of double imputation being necessarily a ritual worship. To the right of that, we have what they refer to as beginning justification, right? What they call progressive sanctification, experienced subjectively. And I'm not going to get into that deep, but suffice to say, they relabel progressive justification as progressive sanctification. All right? It's a sleight of words there. And then they refer to final justification, you see there. Now, at a conference in 2016, I confronted John Piper about this. He was speaking, and there was a question and answer time, and he was speaking of he believes and stated that he believed in assurance of salvation. And I said, no. Even according to Calvin and Luther, and the double imputation has never been predicated by assurance of salvation. Okay, and in fact, Luther and Calvin both wrote against assurance of salvation extensively. Calvin even said that fear of condemnation actually was the driving force behind sanctification. Calvin said it, all right? Calvin absolutely said it. So even though they will vehemently deny that double imputation is progressive justification, it clearly is. They even have what they call, these are their tenets: beginning justification, progressive sanctification experienced subjectively, and final justification. So I confronted Piper and I said, well, then if we're presently saved and have assurance of salvation, why do you call it final justification? And well, it's complicated. It's complicated. Maybe we should talk afterwards. But folks, it's progressive justification. It's necessarily ritualistic worship that requires a return to the original gospel that saved us, staying at the foot of the cross, to reapply Christ's so-called atonement, which it wasn't an atonement, it wasn't a covering of sin, it was an ending of sin. The gospel is not a cover-up. It's an absolute ending of sin. Okay? So let's move on down here. This necessarily excludes love and all good works, and by the so-called believer, and Calvin even states this unequivocally in the Institute's third book, chapter 14, third book, chapter 14, sections 10 and 11, particularly the first sentence of section 11, Calvin states that the cardinal point of that whole chapter, which, by the way, is titled Justification, in what sense progressive? In the 14th chapter of the third book, Calvin even titles the whole chapter, stating, it's in the title, stating that the Protestant gospel and double imputation specifically is a progressive justification. It's the title of his 14th chapter, for crying out loud. So, he says in section 11, first sentence, that the cardinal point is that no professing Christian has ever done a work or could do a good work. So when you have Protestants tell you that you need to be sure to come to church where you can be loved by the elders and the parishioners, it's disingenuous. Because to claim that as a Christian you can love, and of course what they do is they conflate good works with love. You can't do that. Love is a good work. At any rate, it's disingenuous. But only one of a myriad of illogical and contradictions to the true gospel of justification and righteousness by new birth. Okay? If you go down a little bit more, this doctrine is absolutely the driving force behind all of the ill behavior and scandals in the church. Okay? Also, we know, if you go to a little bit to the right there, being under law and an under law gospel necessarily empowers sin. The Bible says that. Paul says that in Romans 6. And again, as far as assurance of salvation, anyone who claims to believe in double imputation and also asserts that you can have assurance, they're being disingenuous, or they're comfortable with the contradiction, or they don't thoroughly understand what the Protestant gospel really is. Also, in regard to my comments about ill behavior in the church, you heard Vodi Bachman say clearly that there's a problem with the whole idea of justice, a justice mentality with a believer who holds to double imputation, right? He mentions that we cry out for justice, we want justice. The only problem is, the only justice for us that there is damnation and condemnation, right? And this echoes what Calvin and Luther wrote about a lot, okay? So now do you thoroughly understand all of the scandals going on in the Protestant church with this cover-up of leaders who were, molesting children or whatever, and more recently the newest scandal concerning John MacArthur Jr. about covering up one of his elders who was molesting his own daughter and others. Do you thoroughly understand that now? To bring that sin to light, to excommunicate these leaders or whatever, would be the implementation of justice on a horizontal level, which they reject. Do you get it now? Okay, there's some blog someplace that is exposing all of this stuff going on in the church, and it's titled, I don't even know if the blog's still around or not, but it was titled "A Cry for Justice." Well, with the doctrine of double imputation, that's a contradiction. Okay? Anything more than eternity in hell is grace in their book. So now you understand why they treat, all of these victims the way they do in church. Let me state it this way. The doctrine of double imputation rejects all horizontal justice, rejects it out of hand. Okay? Now another thing that I'll mention with double imputation before we move on, and they say this incessantly, all of the time, this whole idea that the righteousness of Christ is imputed to us progressively. Clearly, that's what they teach. Now, where in the Bible do we find that it's actually Jesus' righteousness that's imputed to us? We don't. You can kind of make illogical jumps of logic to infer that maybe a couple verses say that. But now what the Bible does say a lot is that God's righteousness is imputed to us. And by the way, it's imputed to us through the new birth and makes us righteous as a state of being. Why? Because we're literally born of God. All right? Now, why this matters is because God is the Father, right? So it is, in fact, if you're talking about justification by new birth, our gospel, justification by new birth, not justification by faith, which is the double imputation gospel, it's important to state that our righteousness comes from God because he's our Father. All right? Technically, Jesus is our brother. Okay? And what they also do, which is also incredibly disingenuous, if you claim to have the righteousness of God in you, okay, you are claiming a righteousness of your own. And that's entirely disingenuous because we're not saying that we're claiming a righteousness of our own. We're saying that we have the righteousness of God that is a part of our being because we're born of God, right? So it's a like righteousness, not a righteousness we were born with, that we are now claiming that we conjured up enough to satisfy the law and thus save us. So that, they make it an either or thing. We're not saying that we were born with a righteousness that finally we were able to progress ourselves enough to satisfy the law and be saved. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that we have the like righteousness of God in our DNA because we're born of God, and the whole new birth thing, though we ask for it and we beseeched God for it, the whole new birth is totally a work of God that we can of course ask for, but the new birth itself is totally an act of the Holy Spirit in totality. Okay, so we got that all the way. Now let's finish up over here to the left side of this chart. And of course, what goes along with this double imputation gospel is the whole idea that Christ's resurrection was merely to confirm that God was satisfied with his active law-keeping while he was alive. That's absurd. That is just so obviously a righteousness according to the law, okay, or justification by law-keeping. Again, it doesn't make any difference who keeps the law. The law is the issue. Excuse me. And I put R.C. Sproul up there in a little circle above because incredibly, while R.C. Sproul was alive, he continually stated that Christ was righteous only because of his perfect law-keeping, and without Christ perfect law-keeping, he wouldn't have had that righteousness and been an apt sacrifice for sin. That's blasphemy. We would contend that, and incredibly, pastors listen to this and don't even blink, but we contend that Christ came to earth righteous by virtue of who he was. By virtue of who he was. Christ didn't earn righteousness. Okay? He was purely righteous, again, by virtue of who he was. So, what I will mention in closing is, if you go to, you can see I have it penciled in down there, if you go to johnpiperslawproblem.com, an associate of our ministry, Andy Young, did a wonderful job of articulating a lot of these issues between justification by new birth and justification by faith, which is the double imputation gospel. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great God-honoring week. And go out and aggressively love God and others with no fear of condemnation. Thank you.